Well, good morning. Welcome to everybody who is on site and those who are joining us online again this week. We are continuing to work through the book of Ruth. And if you have been with us the last few weeks, you know that we have been talking a lot about hope, haven't we? And so it's my hope that you've actually enjoyed this series thus far and have actually been challenged a little bit by understanding what does it look like to go through the seasons of hope that exist in each of our lives. If you've been with us, you know week one we talked about Naomi. We were introduced to this lady named Naomi who experienced the loss of a husband and the loss of her sons, and that led her towards a time of bitterness where she lost hope. And then the chapter ended with a return to Bethlehem, which was her hometown. And just the final verse kind of gives us just a glimmer of hope that something might be coming. And then sure enough, in chapter 2, we saw that hope reawakened in Naomi as she experienced the Hesed. We talked about Hesed lately as well too, this loving kindness of God. This hope awakens in Naomi again as she experiences the Hesed of God. And it was experienced as God was guiding and revealing himself through the faithful actions of Ruth and Boaz. And so now today we come to chapter 3, where this hope that was lost, this hope that was reawakened, this hope now continues to grow in Naomi and allows her to lift her eyes higher than her problems towards the future, and she begins to dream about what could be possible in the days ahead. You know, many of us have gone through seasons like that, haven't we, where the hope kind of ebbs and flows in our lives. I know that for myself as a sports fan, I experience that quite often. And it's not just because I'm an Oilers fan. It could be worse. I could be a Leafs fan, right? And I know. But I was thinking about that this week with the start of the CFL season. And I was reminded that the Elks have not won a home game since October 12th, 2019. Did you know that? It's been that many years. Hope has been lost in the home, hasn't it? But here's the thing. No, see, it hasn't. See, here's the thing. We know that on June 11th, next Sunday, the Elks are going to play the Riders. And what happens when the Elks win? Hope reawakens. Maybe? Know what else happens on June 11th when the Elks beat the Riders? It confirms for us that God is not a Riders fan. Even though many of you believe that he is. That's not true. He's actually a Cowboys fan. That's the truth. You know why Dallas built a stadium with an open roof on it? So God could watch his team play. That was the idea. Anyways, hope will return. Of course, in other areas of life, we know that there's these ebbs and flows that happen, isn't there? In many more important areas of life. Perhaps you have a broken relationship and you had hope, but then in that moment, it's just erased from your life. But then over time, our hearts start to desire to risk again. When we lose a loved one, hope the joy just evaporates from our lives because there's this piece of us that's missing. But then God does a healing work in our lives, and one day a smile returns to our face. And one day we're actually able to laugh again. Not that we've forgotten the loss, but hope reawakens and starts to think of what is possible. When we lose security, whether that be the security of a job or of finances, or just losing the security of peace, there are people in countries around this world where there is a constant threat to their personal security, the loss of peace in their lives. And you hear stories of God over time providing in miraculous ways. We see these ebbs and these flows of hope in all aspects of our lives. But in these moments when the problems start to swell, our world shrinks, doesn't it? Our world tends to shrink. Our vision tends to get cast downwards. It gets limited. And all of a sudden, our vision shrinks. The world shrinks to the size of our problem. But then the day comes where we can start to lift our eyes towards the future possibilities again, as the thrill of hope motivates us to dream what could be yet possible. And when we find ourselves at that point of dreaming what could be possible, it motivates us towards acts of making our hope a reality. And this is where we find Naomi today. We find her where she started with bitterness and the loss of hope, but now she's had a few wins over the last few months. And God has reawoken that hope within her, and she hopes for more than she and Ruth are currently experiencing. See, it's not just a hope for herself. Her world has expanded. Her eyes have been lifted to not just have hope for herself, but she's actually hoping for more in the lives of others. And in particular, in the life of her daughter-in-law, Ruth, who has shown such incredible loyalty and kindness all the way through this journey so far. And so as we pick up the story in Ruth chapter 3, if you want to follow along in your pew Bibles, that's on page 211, or you can use the pew portal. The sermon notes are always in there for you each week. And as we pick up the story in Ruth chapter 3, we see that 2 months have passed. 2 months of harvesting and gleaning have passed. And Naomi still has this motherly concern for Ruth. It's always been there, but it's been renewed in this moment. She loves Ruth. She wants the very, very best for Ruth. And her goal is, remember back in chapter 1, her goal has always been to find a home and a husband for Ruth. As she said back in chapter 1, verse 9, it says, "May the Lord grant you rest in the home of another husband." That rest that she's speaking of is this ending of grief in Ruth's life because of her husband's death. It's a loss of security because she's a widow in a very difficult situation. It's rest from poverty, from security, from a lack of security, the poverty, the ending of grief, all these realities that widows faced in this time and place. And it was customary for parents to arrange marriages, and so Naomi sets to this task essentially, and she basically says to Ruth, "Well, what about Boaz? What Boaz? You already know each other. You've been working together for the past few months, and so this wouldn't exactly be like a blind date. And not only is he wealthy, but he has shown incredible kindness to you, Ruth. And maybe it's not just kindness. Maybe there's a little something more. Maybe he's interested." And you know, Ruth, I think Boaz might have a soft spot in his heart for women of foreign countries who have come to live amongst us here in God's land. Because after all, don't forget, Boaz's mother was Rahab. Remember Rahab? Similar story to Ruth, isn't it? A woman from a foreign land, a foreign people than the Israelites who decides to help Israel. And then she actually joins with those people and lives among them. That's the story of Boaz's mom, Rahab. So maybe he's got a soft spot for somebody in your situation, Ruth. But also, in addition to that, Naomi says it's kind of now or never, because the harvest is coming to an end, and the guys are going to be winnowing the barley over the next couple nights, preparing it so they could store it and sell it. And when they talk about winnowing, when they talk about going to the threshing floor to winnowing, but basically what they're saying here is they're going to take all this barley, all this grain that they've gathered the last few months, and they're going to beat it. They're going to beat it against a hard floor, maybe with a stone or a rock, or by stomping on it with animals to loosen the wheat from the husk. And that's the threshing. But then they're going to winnow it by throwing it up into the wind and allowing all of the light husk to blow away and the heavier grain to fall to the ground. And then they'll package it and they'll store it and they'll go and sell it. And when this is completed, after all of these months of harvesting and all the hard work of winnowing and threshing, when it's all done, it's a time of celebration, especially considering we've just followed years of famine. This is a huge celebration coming. And so Naomi devises the plan because it's now or never. The season's coming to an end. And so she says to Ruth in verse 3, "Ruth, go and wash, put on perfume, and then get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let Boaz know you're there until he has finished eating and drinking. And then when he lies down, note the place where he's lying, and then go and uncover his feet and lie down. And he'll tell you what to do." Now, this is the plan that Naomi hatches. And it's easy to misread what's going on here because some of our modern ideas of how some of these things might look. This might sound, these few verses might sound like kind of the beginning of like a Harlequin novel. Just saying, it might. I've never read one, but I've heard. Okay? I've heard. You know, what is Naomi saying? Is she saying, "Hey, Ruth, go get cleaned up, put on some perfume, that little black dress you have in your closet. Wait till Boaz is good and drunk, and then lay down beside him and make your move." Is that what she's saying? You know, that would be very fitting of the Moabite people of the past, who were very well known for their manipulative, seductive tactics. And so it is kind of easy to read some of that into it, because that's how it sounds from our modern ideas, but also from the history of the Moabite people. That was kind of how they rolled. But that's not who Ruth is. We have not seen any evidence that that is the character of Ruth within this story. And besides, Naomi is trying to make her a wife, not a mom. So Naomi tells Ruth this. Basically what she's saying is, Ruth, you're still mourning your husband, my son, Mahlon. It's time to take off your mourning clothes. It's time to wash. It's time to put on perfume. It's time to go out there and make a visible indication that you are no longer mourning and that you are available to other suitors. And this direction for her to wait until Boaz has done eating and drinking is not waiting until he has had too much drink and his guard is down. Think about the work he was doing all day, threshing and winnowing, and the dirt and the sweat and the grime and the hard work it would take. I think basically what she's saying here is he's going to be tired and hungry when he finishes working. Wait until he's rested. No, we had a marriage enrichment seminar that Nadine and I did here a few weeks back. We kind of talked about this in the category of barriers to good communication. We talked about how if you have an important conversation to have with your spouse, don't plan that conversation just as you get home from work and before you've had dinner. That's the wrong time to have that conversation. You're tired, you want to get changed, you want to eat. No. Deal with those things and then have a conversation afterwards. Sit, eat, rest, then talk. And when she tells Ruth to lay down and notice where Boaz sleeps, it's not about getting him alone so she can do anything seductively. They're looking for privacy. Yes, but privacy because Ruth is breaking a lot of cultural barriers here. She is going to be a foreign woman alone with a very well-known and respected man at the threshing floor where sometimes bad things did take place. She's going to be a woman proposing to a man, which just didn't happen. And all this is going to take place in an environment where we don't need witnesses adding undue pressure to Boaz. And then finally, this command to uncover his feet. There is a euphemism within Scripture that speaks to kind of revealing the private parts of a person, yes. But the author is very careful in this section. He's very careful to use a different word than you would find in that euphemism. The word he uses here of uncovering the feet is the word that would literally mean the extremities or the feet of a person. See, nothing seductive is taking place here. This is an intention to subtly wake up Boaz from his sleep. And so as we read this plan of Naomi, we need to think a little less Harlequin and a little more romance section in the church library. Okay? That's the balance we got to find here. Basically, what Naomi is saying to Ruth is, Ruth, it is time for you to stop mourning your past husband. It's time to stop mourning my son. Boaz is a good man. Boaz is a noble man. And time is running out. It's kind of now or never. The harvest is coming to an end. The gleaning's coming to an end. Your proximity to each other is coming to an end. So after he rests from his hard work, discreetly wake him up. And he will understand by your appearance, and he will understand by your presence what you are proposing to him. Now, I'm going to guess that's probably not how your engagement went. But I got to tell you, 4,000 years ago, this was romantic. Okay? This was romantic 4,000 years ago. Okay? And so Ruth agrees. She agrees to everything that Naomi has told her to do. And with a heavy heart, she takes off of her mourning clothes, and she prepares herself to go to the threshing floor. And she waits till Boaz has done his work, and he's eaten, and he's had a drink, and she sees him go and find a spot at the end of the grain piles to rest. And once everybody is asleep, Ruth quietly approaches him. She uncovers his feet, and then she lays down. And we read this beginning in verse 8. Where it says, in the middle of the night, something startled Boaz. And he turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I'm your servant Ruth, she answered. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. Ruth follows Naomi's plan perfectly, and it works just as she had hoped. But then it comes time for Ruth to speak, to actually make the proposal, and we kind of miss it because we're not familiar with the language and the culture, but Ruth really kind of ad-libs at this point. She goes off on her own a little bit, and she goes her own direction. And here's what I mean by that. When she identifies herself, she says, I am Ruth, I am your servant. And this word servant she uses here is the word amah. And it's a word that is specifically identified to a woman who is eligible to marry. She's saying, Boaz, I'm Ruth. We know each other. I know it's dark, but it's Ruth. I am available to marry. And then she says, spread the corner of your garment over me. Or some versions will say, spread your wing over me. Which is actually going back to what Boaz said to Ruth in chapter 2. When Ruth said, why am I so blessed that you are caring for somebody like me? And Boaz responded by saying, it's not me. It is God under whose wing you have taken refuge. And in this phrase, what Ruth is saying to Boaz is this idea of like a mother bird who extends her wing to bring protection and to extend responsibility to another. And Ruth is calling to Boaz to continue to serve, to continue to work as God's agent of blessing over her. And this idea of extending the corner of the robe was also symbolic of marriage. This is the proposal. This is the proposal. I am a woman eligible to be married. Extend your cloak over me. Take me under your protection. Take me under your care. Take responsibility for me and my household. This is the proposal. But then she adds this. For you are a family guardian redeemer. Now, we are not familiar with all of that means, but this was not part of Naomi's plan. In that one statement, Ruth reminds Boaz that he has the right to buy back the land that Naomi has lost. He has the right and the ability to provide for Naomi. You see, Ruth's marriage proposal also includes a business deal in it. And here's the cool thing that's happened so far in this story. Naomi was looking for Ruth to find rest in a husband, but now Ruth is looking for Naomi to find rest from her poverty. And Boaz is the key to providing both, if he's willing. And so Boaz, again, just deeply impressed by Ruth's devotion to Naomi, wants to honor her. And this is what he says in verse 10. He says, the Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you have shown even earlier. You've not run after younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. For all the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. The kindness he's speaking here is not really the kindness that Ruth is showing to him by a younger woman proposing to an older man. That's not the kindness he's referring to here. It is true. Ruth could have chased after younger, wealthier men to find a husband for herself. But that only would have benefited her. It would have made Naomi happy. That's what Naomi wanted for Ruth, but would have benefited Ruth. But the nature of the proposal that Ruth puts out puts Ruth actually at risk. Because Boaz can buy this field and not marry Ruth. He could simply say, you're right. I can just go take this resource and look after Naomi in the process, but actually gain this field. So Ruth is actually at risk in the nature of this proposal. But what Ruth is proposing, the full understanding of what Ruth is proposing is, Boaz, I offer myself to you as a wife. You can buy back this field for Naomi. We will have children, and our son will be an heir who can reclaim this land for Naomi. If Boaz is agreeable to all of this, Ruth is again putting herself at risk, but making herself available, not just to find a husband for herself, but to provide for Naomi and the generations to come. This is the kindness that he's speaking of. And he wants to honor her. That's why he calls her a woman of noble character. Ruth, you are a treasure, he's saying to her. Ruth, you are worthy of all of these wonderful things that people are saying. If you will be a wonderful wife. But there's a problem, he says. There's a problem. And the problem is not with you, Ruth. The problem's not with me. The problem's not with Naomi. The problem is that there's actually another relative closer who has the right of first refusal. And he might want to buy the land. But then he tells Ruth, don't worry. I will do everything required to make this happen. And I will get on it tomorrow morning first thing. And he invites Ruth to stay the night because it's not safe for her to walk home at night on her own in this time. He doesn't want to raise any gossip of what was happening as she came in during the day and then she left in the middle of the night. And so she stays for the night. And as the sun begins to rise, and before any of the partiers from last night can wake up, Ruth slips out and she leaves to go home. But before she can leave, Boaz stops her and promises her once again, I will make sure that this deal gets done first thing today. I will give the other relative an opportunity to redeem you. But if he's not willing, then as surely as the Lord lives, I will be the one who does it. And he takes her shawl and he pours 60 pounds of freshly threshed barley into her shawl, and she returns home. Why did he give her the barley? Speculation. That maybe to cover in case anyone is wondering, why were you there? Oh, it's getting barley. Maybe. I think more of it was a message to Naomi. Because what Naomi wanted to have happen hasn't happened yet. Things are still hanging in the balance. But he wants us to send a message to Naomi confirming the success of Ruth's evening. And here's what I mean. Naomi's been up all night wondering what has been going on. And so she greets Ruth at the door when Ruth comes in. And she's eager to hear about the night that she had. And she says this in verse 16. She says, when Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, how did it go, my daughter? And then Ruth told her everything that Boaz had done for her. And she added, he gave me 6 measures, 60 pounds of barley, saying, do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Do not go back empty-handed. Remember back in chapter 1? Ruth came back to Bethlehem when people said, welcome back, Naomi. And Naomi said, don't call me that, call me Mara. I left full and I've returned empty. I'm full of bitterness. I've lost all hope. But now here we are, at the end of chapter 3. And Ruth comes back saying, I do not want your mother-in-law to be empty-handed. Look at the abundance of God's goodness. Look at the abundance of what he's provided. And God had been providing. And Naomi's hope had been renewed. And it would motivated her to put a plan into action. So she confidently says at the end of chapter 3, she says, just wait, Ruth. I know that Boaz will not rest until this matter is settled this very day. Oh, you know, when I read this story, sometimes I feel like it shouldn't be named the book of Ruth. Right? Do you know what I mean? Sometimes I feel like this should be named the book of Naomi. Because isn't that sometimes how it feels? Like that's really the story, isn't it? It's the story of following Naomi's journey. An Israelite widow who experienced the hesed, this loving kindness of God. She experiences the covenant promises of God. The God who promised that I will never leave you and I'll never forsake you. Naomi is living in the midst of that. She's experiencing that every single step of the journey. Are there times in the story when she faces challenges that lead to bitterness and it causes her to lose sight of some of that? Absolutely. But as we learned in the last 2 weeks, when those moments happen in our lives or when those moments happen in Naomi's lives, does that mean that God has disappeared? Does that mean that God has stopped loving? Does that mean that God has stopped caring? Or can we believe that God is still true to his promises, that God is always bigger than our problems? Amen? You see, sometimes there are things in this world, there's some things in Naomi's story that will block our view of this. That sometimes there are things that will happen that will block the light that God is shining into our lives, but that doesn't mean that the light is gone. You know, when I was thinking about this concept this week, it reminded me of like a solar eclipse, where when the moon comes, it gradually, slowly blocks the sun. And as it moves across the sky, as it gradually more and more blocks the sun, it gets a little darker. It gets a little eerier, a little more ominous, a little bit more of an unsettled feeling can grow inside of us as the moon comes across. Have you ever seen a solar eclipse? It's kind of how it feels. And for a moment, the moon appears to be the same size as the sun, as the darkness of this satellite appears to be more powerful than the light. But then, there's the shimmering band of light that dances along the edges. And a flash of light all of a sudden appears into the darkness. And the world gradually, one step at a time, becomes more and more and more illuminated once again. And we realize in that moment, the sun was always there. The sun was always larger. The sun was always more powerful. We only for a moment perceived the moon to be the same size. We only for a moment perceived the moon to be more powerful than the light. And when I think about this and in the way that we experience this in our lives and the way that Naomi experienced this in her lives, I'm reminded of the words that Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus, where he says this to them. He says, I pray that your hearts would be flooded with light, that they would be flooded with light, so that you can understand the confident hope he has given to those that he has called. His incomparably great power for those of us who believe. Isn't that an amazing verse? That in all seasons of life, in every season of life that you may go, we're all here at different seasons. Some of us are here today and we're feeling pretty good. Things are going okay. We'd be happy if this day just repeated tomorrow. We'd be okay with that. But I know there's others here who are going through times of grief. I know there are others who are in a season of fear, wondering what if the challenge before us seems so big. That's what we're staring at. That's what we're fixed on. And when our problems seem bigger and more powerful than the sun in our lives, this verse can remind us to place our hope in the Son of God that is in our lives. The God who has promised to always be with us, to never leave us, to never forsake us. And this is just the start of it, though. Do you realize it? This is just the start. This is the foundation upon which we stand, because it is from this belief, it is from this knowledge of the truth that is shared in this verse that we can be flooded with light, that we can have confident hope, that we can have confidence in the incomparably great power of God that is for us. It is upon that foundation that we stand, that we just start, because it is from there that we are motivated towards holy living. It is from there that we're motivated to take those steps of faith. It is from there that we start to take those acts of love for others. And it's kind of what we see in Ruth and Boaz, as they have this confident hope that motivates them towards an others-centered love, acts of others-centered love. Remember back in week 1, we talked about this, about how when we're motivated towards these acts for others, people see us, they experience us as though we were clothed in godly virtues. Remember that? That's what it means when Boaz refers to Ruth as a woman of noble character. And in chapter 2, when Boaz is introduced essentially as a man of noble character. It's that when people encountered them, when they were experiencing them, in a relationship with them, they were presenting something that pointed them back to God. And we as the people of God have the exact same opportunity every single day of our lives. We have the opportunity to choose what we will clothe ourselves with. You know how that feels, don't you, when you wake up in the morning? And sometimes we'll pick our clothes based on how we're feeling, right? If we're feeling a little bit down, maybe to pick something that's a little bit darker and a little bit baggier. If we're feeling happy, it's like, I've never worn yellow before. Let's wear yellow today. I don't know. Let's see how that goes. Sometimes we're going to work in the yard, so we'll put on the old T-shirt. If we're going to go on a date, we're going to put on the shirt that our wife ironed for us, because that's clearly the one we're going to wear. See, as we put these things on, people then experience us, but they also, they look at us and they can experience what we're wearing. It's part of the image that we present to the world around us. It's part of what we represent that we bring to the world. And in a similar fashion, Paul talks about this in Colossians 3. When he says this in Colossians 3, verse 12. When he says, where's it here? Right there. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you, and over all of these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. These are clothes. These are virtues that we can clothe ourselves in. That when we wear these things and we go into the world and people experience us, they see that on us and in us. But it doesn't just reveal us. It reveals the one that we represent. And I cannot stress this enough. The world needs to experience more people of godly character. The world needs to experience more people of godly character. We know this past week we just went through an election, and what was the number one issue they said? The entire month of campaigning, the number one issue was, who can you trust? Which candidate can you trust? That question was a reflection upon character, upon what they had clothed themselves with in the past. Were either of them noble? Were either of them worthy? Were either of them trustworthy? Were the questions that were being asked. Which virtues have we experienced and can we expect going forward? And how people answered that question not only affected how they voted, but how we answered that question also makes a difference for what we expect of them, how we view these candidates, and who they represent, and what they stand for. And so as we consider this verse, and as we consider that we go into the world, who are we? How does the verse start? We are God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. He's speaking about those who have placed their trust in Jesus Christ, who have the light of Christ dwelling not just on them, within them, motivating the steps that they take, the opportunities that exist in the world around them. And so as we take this confident hope in the God whose light can flood into our lives, gives us confident hope of the assurance of this incomparable power available through God in us. And then we allow that to fill us up to an overflowing. It can motivate us towards these acts of Hesed, that people might experience Jesus through us when they see us. And so I want to challenge you. As you look at this list, is there one or two that just jump out at you? Is there one or two of these virtues that you could clothe yourself with this coming week, where you could clothe yourself and you could lift your eyes and you could ask that hopeful question, what might happen this week? If every day this week I woke up and before I got out of bed, I made the decision to clothe myself in compassion, to choose kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, forgiveness, love. If I chose to put that on at the start of each day, just what might be possible in the world and in the people that I encounter? How could they experience the same hope that motivates me? Maybe I'd have a greater sense and ability to meet my spouse's needs. Man, if I put some of these on, how could it impact my marriage? Maybe it'll motivate you to step out and to humbly serve another person who can absolutely do nothing in return for you. And simply by wondering, I wonder how different their day will be because I chose to put on compassion today. Or maybe it'll motivate you to seek or to extend forgiveness that has long been overdue. And when the person asks you, why now? What's different today that you wouldn't allow me to have that forgiveness yesterday? And you can share with them your hope story. Your hope story of the difference that Jesus Christ makes in your life. And just maybe it cannot just change their day, but it can change their eternity. Maybe by putting on some of these virtues based upon a confident hope in Jesus Christ that motivates us towards actions of love, just maybe it would inspire us to do these things, that we could fulfill the hope in others, as Naomi sought to do for Ruth, as Ruth sought to do for Naomi, and as Boaz will seek to do for both. But you have to come back next week to see how that works out. And as we look at this passage, and we think about this concept, these words of Paul, I'm convinced that Paul was not thinking of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, though, as he wrote these words. But rather, he was thinking of Jesus Christ, who epitomizes what it means to put love in action. Isn't that true? And as we have an opportunity to come to the communion table together today to think about that and to reflect upon it, we're reminded of a command he gave us as well that is fitting with this. He said in John 15, he says, "My command is this, that you would love each other as I have loved you. There's no greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for a friend." We all know what it's like to walk in darkness, don't we? We know what it's like to be on that side of having our lives eclipsed by sin, by waywardness, by wrong choices. And in those moments, there's this skewing of the view of the light. But Jesus Christ is the light of the world. Jesus Christ is the power, the light that has power to overcome all of that darkness that exists in our lives, to be the light in our lives. And he demonstrated that so beautifully as he laid down his life on our behalf, as he went to the cross to bear the punishment for our sins, and then was buried, and a stone was rolled, and darkness descended. But then powerful light reemerged. The stone was rolled away, and the power of God reached into the grave and raised him from the dead, conquering sin, hell, death, and the grave. And that same power to bring light in the darkness of our lives exists in this place, because Jesus is available to each and every single one of us. I don't just mean at that first moment of confession, first moment of profession of faith, which if you have not accepted Jesus Christ into your life, if you have never said yes, thank you, Jesus, for paying the price for my sins, to move me from darkness to light, to be the light in my life. As you gave your life for me, I give you mine. If you've never received the forgiveness of Christ, I encourage you to do so and to experience that light. But I don't just mean that one first initiatory moment of coming to faith. I mean every single day, as we talked a moment ago, we have a choice as we wake up every morning to be thankful for the gift of life and to live that life in a new experience of what does it mean to have a deeper well of experience with Jesus Christ. To have that light shine brighter in us and through us as we go into this world. Because that light is available continually until we stand before him in that glorious light. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and he calls us to lay down our lives before him to receive his forgiveness, but also to lay down our lives for others, to serve them humbly with compassion and kindness and forgiveness and love, as an example that we represent him, who is the source of all those things. And as we come to this communion table, we do so with an opportunity to remember the cost that made it all possible. The bread symbolic of his body that was broken and offered freely for us. The cup symbolic of his blood that was shed to cover a multitude of our sins. And so as we now approach this opportunity to remember, to celebrate, and to say thank you, I encourage you just to take a moment and to reflect upon these things we've talked about today. To think about the forgiveness that needs to be extended to others, the forgiveness we've received from Christ, the things we may need to confess, or the things that we may need to leave this place in a few moments, to step into another person's life to make things right. So I'll give you a moment to reflect upon those things, and then I'll join you at the table.